The question that's coming up for me as you tell that story is, what is the nature of failure?
We are all, no matter where we're at in life, one question away from a completely different life.
And ask yourself, like, who would I be without that thought? Or who would I be without that feeling or that sensation? I didn't even put that thought or that sensation there.
Welcome to Commune. We are on a mission to inspire, heal, and bring the world closer together.
Just to set us up a little bit, this is a book about questions and how we can utilize inquiry as a method of reflection. And
Correct.
you know, you've aggregated a stunning array of questions, and in some ways, I think of them as thought experiments to be applied on oneself. um, and you've done that. You've gathered these from a wide variety of thought leaders and intellectuals, artists, executives, athletes, folks like Kobe Bryant, Maya Angelou, Picasso, Steve Jobs, a bunch of others. And I'm excited to probe at a number of them specifically. But perhaps as just an on-ramp to the conversation, you can give us all a little background on how you came to write the book and the questions that arose for you as part of that process.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the book came out of a really tough couple of years, let's just say, after, and I'll provide a little bit of backstory, but essentially, the book came out of the realization that we are all, no matter where we're at in life, one question away from a completely different life or different outcome if you're thinking of business in any sense. And how I got to that point was spending a decade in the corporate world in sales, analytics, and product management, and you know, following that ladder and doing well in that job. But throughout those years, I had this reflective practice early in the morning, which was journaling. And it started with reading and trying to inject positive information into my mind before starting the day, even 10, 15 minutes, right? Just to start the day with a prime mind. And then all of a sudden, as you're reading more and more and reading profiles and biographies and things like that, 100% of these people had some sort of reflective practice, and they were all asking powerful questions throughout that text. Or then when podcasts started to come online, you would hear in the interviews these massive questions dropped in the conversation. And I remember I always had this annoyance before I was a host myself, was that the question we'd be left, because the arc was usually this. You know, there was a history, there was a story, something was happening, it went up, it hit a climax or a wall, everything exploded. And then the subject on the other side would say something like, and then I thought about this. And
Mm.
then life carried on. But the host would rarely say, well, let's talk about that question. They would jump right into the next business or the next idea and how they navigated that next road. I was writing the question down and thinking, wow, like one question completely pivoted that person's journey. And, even though I was in a different place or not in, similar circumstances, I had my own career and own life and whatnot, like we all do. I would then journal on the question in relation to where I was at and try to get some value from that prompt. And this went on for, like I said, about a decade, 8 to 10 years, in that corporate role, until I finally grew frustrated with the digital options for journaling. Because I was traveling a lot, and I had first started doing these practices in a word processor on my computer. And then I continued to travel, then I would pull out a phone or an iPad or something like that. And was using note apps essentially. But there was always this disconnect of copying and pasting these prompts that I kept finding every morning in my reading, and then using them to guide the reflection. So, and at the same time, I think it was helpful at the time. Headspace and Calm on the meditation front were really starting to take off from a mainstream perspective. So there was a bit of a light bulb moment, thinking, well, it seems like people are open to digital guidance when it comes to some of these wellness practices. And at the time, there was nothing that existed like that for journaling other than basically a word processor in an app formation.
Hmm.
So that's, what ended up happening was I left that job. I partnered up with my brother-in-law and co-founder of the app, Keo. And essentially we set out to create this app, which was guided by prompts. And long story short, we collaborated with a ton of stunning brands and humans, people like Adam Grant and brands like Lego and LinkedIn and VaynerMedia and all these different people to get their reflective questions and show people on the other side that these practices aren't just for meditation teachers or yoga instructors. I was interviewing the chief strategy officer at VaynerMedia or chief of operations of Lego and showing how this stuff can be used in day-to-day life in really any circumstance. And it seemed to resonate well because we ended up reaching about 86.9 million people with the app. Those are store impressions, but nonetheless, we were getting featured, and we were really proud about that because we weren't app developers and had no idea what we were doing. We're just trying to get something out to solve my own problem. Uh, and Basically, I'll save all the details, but what happened, we reached a lot of people, a lot of features, but that didn't mean our business was working. And our business model was failing us. We weren't making enough money to sustain the further development of the app. We needed more time, more resources, and more mental capacity. We were pretty tapped out on all of those areas, and that's I share this because that's what led to the book. Because at that moment, I'll never forget, I was in a co-working space in Toronto, Canada, and I was looking at the Apple dashboard, which was showing me the app metrics, and I'm looking at that 86.9 million. And my next step is to hit delete from App Store. And a whole flurry of questions, all the wrong questions, essentially started floating through my mind at like warp speed. How could we fail at such a colossal level? What would my ex-colleagues think that I remember when I was, explaining to them that I was leaving to pursue this idea? There was this sense of, wow, like you're so courageous for doing this. And, I have an idea too, but I just can't, come to terms in leave this job. And here I am now feeling like, my tails between my legs type thing. And we failed. It's done. And that led to some really deep reflection. So I'll pause there, as I said a lot, but
Well,
that's that backstory.
yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I'll just probe at that a tiny bit because the question that's coming up for me as you tell that story is, what is the nature of failure?
Yeah.
How do we define failure? What is the feeling that arises in the experience of what it is like to be me that is failure? and
Yeah.
all and this is why self-inquiry or inquiry is so useful, is that as you begin to pull that apart and dissect it, what you're really getting at is, I'm afraid of judgment. It's, what are other
Correct.
people going to think of me when I press delete?
Yeah.
What am I going to think of myself? Do I need the approval of others? Is my identity baked in to what I do? Like all these like super
Yeah.
seminal questions. So, I told you I would take you on some tangents here. But
I love it.
I looked up question because I was interested in like, what is the nature of question itself? And I'm about to talk to the question guy, and I just started thinking about it because I've never really dissected the word before. But yeah, if you go back, I think in Latin it's quaerere or something like that, which is to
Okay.
ask, but it's also to seek. And if obviously
Yeah.
within the word question is quest, a quest to know, you
Mm.
know? Um,
Hmm.
and when you apply that quest to know on yourself, you are the subject of your own science experiment. And so you're applying the rigors of the scientific method to your own life. It's like, what is
Yeah.
my hypothesis? What is the experiment? What's the observation? What's the reasoning? How do I modify my hypothesis? What's my conclusion about myself? So as you were groping in the dark through this process, what was the question that you landed on that then kind of broke the doors open?
There was one big question that I only was able to get to the prompt by really relying on the present moment and gratitude practices.
Mm,
Thankfully, the 3 years of building that app and interviewing all of these different remarkable humans left all of these practices. But during that hit delete moment, there was so much fear and anxiety about the future and what was next that it was almost impossible to, go back into into the database essentially and retrieve all of that stuff without really doing some serious work. And that's where I remember even when hitting delete, there was a moment where I just paused, took a breath, and reflected on, well, I'm deleting this. I don't know what's next. It doesn't feel good. It feels terrifying. But at the same time, I'm deleting it on a laptop that most people in the world do not have. And, slowing down and trying to reframe my mind or the narrative that was starting to spin with a quick little exercise on gratitude. And I kept doing that day in and day out for weeks until eventually was able to be clear enough and ask the question, what do I want for my life?
mm,
And that was the first series of progressive questions that no matter where you go after that question, I mean, it's leading you forward down the path, right down the journey. And for me, it reignited the hope and possibility and the drive. And then that question led to another, and then it leads to, well, who do you need to speak with? What do you need to do today just to get one step closer to that journey? And that was the moment when the realization was made that that question saved me, because without that question,
mm,
I was going into deep depression. I could feel it. I had worked in mental health in my past life and I knew the triggers and I could feel it. I remember thinking, I can see how easy this would be to slip down a really dark path and, get to a point where, maybe a question wouldn't pull me out of that. Something more serious would have to pull me out. So thankfully, in my case, that one question changed everything for me.
mm. And I think one thing that you just touched on is really important, is that you can come to know the right question, but it's not as if the right answer appears within one sentence in
Mm,
consciousness as just a
yeah.
spontaneous emergence. um,
Yeah.
as you say, this one question also precipitated other questions. So I
Yeah.
wonder, can you maybe break down what the process is of addressing the questions, the keystone questions that emerge?
Well, I think at its core, a question gives us the luxury of a pause, right?
Mm,
Whether it's a pause in an autopilot of an internal narrative that's driving you to a place that you don't want to be going, which was at that time for me, or a pause in just general life and society where we're not thinking and we're just moving through the motions, a day starts, a day finishes, rinse and repeat. We keep going. So for me, that's why I'm obsessed with these questions, because if you find and you land on a question that is relatable to your life and your current circumstances, it can make all the difference. And it gives again, that luxury of slowing down to answer it, and it sparks our curiosity and trains our curiosity muscles, which is profiled in Chip's profile in the book. But just it's a way to train our curiosity muscles. Then all of a sudden, we start seeing more questions pop up, and we become more curious in essentially all aspects of life. And we start becoming more clear and more clear. And then from the clarity, we start acting with more intention and start this. I'm just explaining how my path was going, but also what I see in all the interviews is that it starts with clarity type seeking questions that then lead to intentional action, or setting an intention for the day on how you want to feel, how you want to show up for yourself and others and so forth, and it just keeps snowballing in a positive loop.
Yeah. What really resonates there for me is pause. Viktor Frankl has that, amazing quote that, between stimuli and response lies your growth, right?
Hmm.
That's where that pause is, if you can cultivate it. And I think
Yeah,
the question helps to precipitate or to instantiate that moment before you just react, you know.
correct.
Um, and this is a theme that is echoed in Stoicism and mindfulness and all sorts of spiritual traditions, is to find that pause, to be responsive and not reactive.
Yeah.
And it's so easy to become identified with knee-jerk reactions, and
Hmm.
oftentimes that is a knee-jerk response to one's judgment of a particular event and not to the event itself. So just
Yeah.
that pause is
Well, and Jeff,
brilliant.
just even
Yeah,
asking, when you're in the pause and speaking of judgment, then usually the second question is, well, why? Where's that judgment coming from? And then,
yeah,
it just starts slowly unpacking it. And to your point, it doesn't, the answer doesn't have to lie in one sentence in one sitting. James Clear says this, you're not going to nail your identity in one go. Right. So, be
yeah.
kind to yourself, but you're clear, for going through those steps, and it just becomes, incremental and blocks of progress.
Yeah, and I think this modern society that's so punctuated right now, given everything that's going on,
Yeah.
with a lot of outrage, a lot of fear, a lot of anger, um, and just to be able to find that moment and ask yourself, like, who would I be without that thought? Or who would I
Mm,
be without that feeling or that sensation? And
yeah.
how is that? I didn't even put that thought or that sensation there. It just simply arose as
Yeah.
phenomena in awareness. And I can witness it and not fixate or identify with it. It's like this stuff.
Correct.
Um, so I want to get at the title for a second,
Sure.
because it obviously references Greek antiquity. um, and I think everyone has a general sense of who Socrates was. Brilliant philosopher, predecessor of Plato in 5th century BC. But what is the Socratic method, and how is that relevant to this method of questions?
So there's a backstory to the title, and I actually hated the name at first, and it came from the owner of the publishing company, Joey, because when I was explaining kind of my backstory, which I just described to you and the listeners, and then also explaining how I was learning from all of these top level thinkers, Joey immediately said, "Oh, so the Socratic method." I said, "The Socratic what?" Because I mean, like most people, I knew of Socrates and knew essentially very high level philosopher, asked questions, many questions. That was kind of my my
Yeah.
level of knowledge, without any type of philosophy undergrad or anything like that. So when I started digging into it, though, what fascinated me with Socrates was that here's a guy that has a method that's been developed in, I think it was 469 BC, has stood the test of time, where most of us are doing it without even knowing we're doing it. And there's a way, I think there is a way, or this is where my curiosity sparked with how do we how do we how do we follow the method with more intention and modernize it in some capacity? Because I
Hmm.
came across these 6 question types: clarity and challenging assumptions and whatnot. And they were very much so used in an academic setting. Socrates was asking these type of questions to his students and so forth, and back and forth. And I can't, without even opening the book, I mean, I probably can't rhyme off all 6 types, which was the problem. And the reason for thinking, well, if we can't remember the specifics of the Socratic method, then we're not going to use it intuitively and intentionally. So how can we modernize that? And this is where the structure of the book came into. We can all remember that, starting with being clear and asking questions to unlock and surface more clarity, uh, is a great starting point, and then that leads into intentionality and questions to help be more intentional with your thinking and your reactions. And then that's it, because if you do those two steps, the third step automatically happens, and that's expansion of opportunity, right? Because then
Mhm.
you see the signs, everything seems more clear. Your mind's not fogged with emotion and relationships or situations that are holding you back. You can see, just like a neatly organized room, you can see the back corner of the room. Your mind is clear like that. So so then the title really grew on me, because it made sense, and the realization that, what, we can all have, or we can all be our own personal Socrates, and have essentially like our Socratic coach sitting on our shoulder at all times.
Yeah, I mean, the the one quote I know really is the unexamined life is not worth living. I mean, I feel like that's the
Correct.
tag for the book, more or less.
Yeah, it's
Um,
in there actually, that
eh,
that line.
okay, good, because that's really the core of what's happening here, in inquiry. And of course, I've always associated the Socratic method with a certain kind of argumentative dialogue between
Yeah,
individuals, generally based on questions, posing questions as a means to stimulate critical thinking, but also to refute certain presuppositions that may be
of
on
course.
faulty ground. Um, and I see this as almost engaging in that kind of, I think with Plato it became more of dialectic. I think that's the term he used. But that you're engaging in this dialectic or this dialogue with yourself,
Correct. Yeah,
as part of inquiry, which I think is fascinating, because whether we like it or not, it, we're constantly maintaining this chatterbox in our head,
yeah,
right? Of like, I'm cold, I'll put on a sweater. Are you sure you're cold? I don't know. Maybe we should. I don't know if I never liked living in the Northeast. Maybe I should. You're this, like, our brain is like on this nonstop
yeah,
chatterbox, anyways. And to tame that and to engage in some kind of more intentional kinds of dialogue, um, I think can be incredibly useful,
yeah,
and clearly, it has been for you and for so many people. Um, and I really do love the organizing principle that you leveraged for the different types of questions, because, like you, I can't remember the six, um,
yeah. They're in the
components
book. I
to
mean, we can look
there.
at them, but
We can look at them, but I do
yeah,
remember getting clear, living intentionally, and expanding possibility or opportunity. So that
yeah,
is helpful,
yeah,
for me. Well, let's dive into some of the questions, and some of the thought leaders from the book, because that's kind of where a lot of the meat and potatoes are.
sure.
And maybe we'll start with our mutual friend, because we can make fun of him with impunity just because he's such a good guy. We both know him. Chip Conley, who is this legendary hotelier. He was kind of the biggest, I think, boutique hotel owner operator in the United States at one juncture with Joie de Vivre. I stayed at his first hotel, which I believe was the Phoenix
Mm,
in San
yes.
Francisco, in the Tenderloin, which was pretty gritty, but he renovated an old motel, and it made it so cool. We used to stay there all the time. It's awesome. And now he has this beautiful concept that he's expanded upon, called the Modern Elder Academy, and we can touch on how that
Yeah.
maybe came to be. But let's start with Chip. What was his question, and how did you come to understand it? And then we can probe at it together.
Yeah, Chip is just, I mean, as you know, he's just one of those humans that is always willing to help and offer, graciously his time. I remember when I shut the app down, and when I was in that moment of, or in those moments of darkness and feeling lost, I emailed him, and he fired back a few really great questions, essentially. I thought,
Yeah.
this is ironic. I'm kind of turning into the question guy and was just met with questions back. So, I mean, that's a bit of our backstory. And so, Chip, for the people that are in the book, or the profiles that are in the book, that those people are still around today, I've interviewed all of them. So a lot of the information in the profile and the prompts are inspired by those interviews. And the people that have passed, like the Kobe Bryants and Maya Angelou, I had to do a different style of research. But in Chip's case, when we had our conversation, there was a lot of discussion around curiosity and how to train your curiosity muscles, essentially, by asking questions. So his prompt, the opening prompt, is, how can I be the most curious person in the room? And the profile goes through, essentially, different practices and different exercises that you can do to kind of shift your perspective, and ultimately get to the point where the most curious person in the room is also the most present. And that's where it gets really interesting on the ripple effect of being present. Because we all know someone that, is in, whether it's a Zoom meeting or in person. Even Zoom's probably even worse, because people think that, that you can't tell when someone's not present in the meeting. But, you can. We're pretty smart humans at the end
Yeah.
of the day. And there's just I think the term that Chip uses, this karmic capitalism, or karmic was it karmic capitalism? I'm probably getting that wrong. Uh, anyway, the idea was essentially leaving people feeling valued and cherished by giving the presence. And ultimately, when you're doing that, you're also intrigued, and you start asking really good questions, and people
Yeah.
remember that, right?
Absolutely. Brendan, who we both have a relationship with too, is a Brendan Burchard. He's always kind of hammering on this too. It's like, what is the intention that I want to bring into this interaction? And how
Yeah.
do I bring presence into that interaction such that the person with whom I'm interacting feels valued and feels
Hmm.
heard? And how much value that ultimately provides us,
Yeah.
when you establish those parameters of
Of course.
value, you know, and the other um, idea that this particular prompt brought up for me, which is new to the experience of what it's like to be me, is is that I've become very comfortable with being confused.
Oh,
And
explain. I like that.
and this really, for me, ties into curiosity and feeds it. Because, like, let's say me and like basically half the rest of the world have become moonlighting microbiologists over the last 18 months, right? With COVID. Okay.
Absolutely.
So it's like, I'll tell you everything about ACE2 receptors that you want to know. And, but the first time I was reading about how the spike protein like infects a cell and how it connects to an ACE2 receptor and hijacks the capacity of the cell to replicate. I mean, I didn't study any of this.
Sure.
And so the first time I was reading like primary source data on the NIH website, I'm like, bloody fucking hell! I'm going to like close my laptop up. I don't want to be curious about that. It's too confusing, you
Yeah.
know. But then, and this has happened in my life with a number of things that I've become moderately fluent with, which is just like surrendering to the discomfort of confusion
Mm,
and just nodding your head and going along on that ride and just being persistent and being calm and being present until you understand what the mitochondria does,
yeah.
or you understand what short chain fatty acids do, and like, of
For
course, I
sure.
didn't go to school in any of these things, but there to in order to, I think, continue to be curious, you need to drop any worry or any discomfort with confusion. Um,
Correct. Yeah.
and it's really just opened up like a big world. It's almost like, I don't know what that quote is, but the bigger fire you light in the darkness, all it does is reveal how much more darkness there is.
Oh, that's deep. I like it.
Yeah. So the more you know, the more you realize you don't know,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that's just flames your, or at least my
Yeah.
curiosity. So I love this one, and and of course, Chip, he had this great career, and then he was very surprisingly got a call from Brian Chesky, who's the one of the founders of Airbnb, and Brian was like, "Come and be on our executive committee." And Chip shows up at Airbnb, and he literally didn't understand a single word anyone was saying because they they were like, "Well, here's this legendary hospitality guy," but Airbnb was a tech company, so they were using language that he literally had no idea what they were talking about. But what he was really good at was the wisdom of how to organize teams and how to listen
Hmm.
and how to be curious. And, for a company, a tech company with a bunch of 20 somethings, there
Yeah.
was this role for the modern elder.
Yeah.
And it was a very two-way street because Chip was bringing in a lot of cool insight, but he was also learning so much at the same time, and that's the cool
Yeah.
part of it.
Well, and that's the second part or topic of his profile is just around the concept of who a modern elder is, because Chip is the one that enlightened me on thinking differently, because I think in Western culture in general, we don't have the same level of respect for our elders, let's say, than other country or other cultures, let's say. And going back to that Airbnb experience, at one point, just for the listeners, the teams at Airbnb started referring to Chip as the elder, which he didn't like, right? Because when you think of elder, you think of someone that's kind of on their way out, and anyone that knows Chip, I mean, he's far from being on his way out. So he reframed it and coined the term modern elders, and I just love that because there's an information share there, right? From, it doesn't matter what age you're at, but I remember around the same time that I had my interview with Chip, I then went on a men's group retreat with every man, and one of the exercises was, I'll never forget this. It gives goosebumps just sharing it. We were lined up, and we had our modern elder in front of us, and we were about maybe a foot apart, eyes locked into each other, and there was one prompt. The modern elder had to share or pass on wisdom from their life, and then the younger person, I guess you could say, had to then share, well, what would you like to share and pass on to the modern elder. And there was just this beautiful exchange that had nothing to do with age and had everything to do with wisdom,
Mm.
wisdom and energy, and just learning together and being a tribe and a community. It was just a beautiful thing. So I really love the work that Chip's up to over at the Modern Elder Academy.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah, I'm, particularly if you look at indigenous cultures, the role of the elder was such a high esteemed role because they had so
Yeah.
much wisdom to impart. And now, of course, like the allopathic medicine system sort of like, you know, keeps people alive longer, but it also often cubbyholes them in nursing
Yeah,
homes, and where it's just where our elders have become seen as nuisances sometimes,
exactly.
and I
Yep.
think we need to reinstantiate this notion of the indigenous culture's respect
Yeah.
for the elder, um, and Chip is obviously on that in spades. So So let's talk about some more questions.
Sure, sure.
So there's a journalist and author who I wasn't as aware of until I actually read the book, named Cal Fussman, right? And
Oh, yeah, Cal.
um, so talk about Cal a bit and unveil Cal's seminal question.
Cal is, if anyone Googles him or listens to any interviews or podcasts, I'm just warning you, you're going to be on the edge of your seat, just waiting for the story to unfold, because he's one of those people that is poetic in how he speaks. And he speaks slowly, and he's got this raspy voice, and you just hang on the words. And I was listening to his podcast, and over time just got to the point where I would love to interview him and see how he comes up with or thinks about his questions, because he at the time was, I think, right at the tail end of a long career as a writer for Esquire magazine, where he had interviewed a good number of U.S. presidents and Muhammad Ali, Robert De Niro. I mean, any celebrity you can think of somehow has gone through Cal's tape recorder at that time. And so I wanted to know, how do you ask the best questions? And that's his opening prompt. And I'll never forget what he shared in that. And it's something I use in my own on my own podcast now. And it was this tactic of putting in the research and the effort, and being prepared for the interview, and writing down every question that comes to mind, and just rapid fire, just firing them off, and having that list there. But then when going into the interview, to rip that up, and
Mm-hmm.
coming back to what we were talking about presence.
Yeah.
Because, and what I write about in the profile is that, you don't have to be a podcast host or a journalist to leverage this. It's really coming, the moral of the story is that you come in doing the mental work and the prep, the questions, and really the intentions that you want to get out of that. But then when you dial into the situation, the meeting, the interview, whatever it is, you are 100% present in the information exchange happening, and you're trusting that your mind will pull down the right question next. And I mean, it's a beautiful thing to experience when that happens, right?
It is. It's a tightrope, and it requires us confidence and to take a certain leap. And I often think of it in, as you were talking, I was relating it to music, where let's say a pianist is rehearsing for a big performance at Carnegie Hall or wherever. And there is a certain, you're learning your scales and you're practicing the piece and you're building what I call the technical well. But
Mm,
then when you get on stage, you need to throw the technical well away. It's sitting there, of course, below the crust of consciousness. But at that juncture, you're really not tapping the technical well. You're tapping the spiritual well. And
yeah.
but it does take a certain leap of faith. I just interviewed Paul Hawken 2 days ago on his new book called Regeneration. And
He's coming on my show in a few weeks.
oh, great, brilliant,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, he's just such an amazing, inspiring guy, and there's a tremendous amount of technical information to know about how to reverse global warming,
Yeah.
and IPCC reports, and the Paris Accords, and 1.5 degrees centigrade and 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit. And there's all this like facts and figures, and renewable energies and all this stuff. But at the end of the day, I had to, just like you say, when I sat down with him, I had built the technical well, but just gotta don't overthink it, right?
Yeah.
Just
I'm
be
gonna have to use
there.
that myself.
Yeah. Well, I also had the luxury of listening to Rich Roll's interview of him that they had just done. So,
Well,
that's a
that's how mine came to be. I listened to that interview with Rich Roll, and then reached out to Paul saying, "Oh, I'd love to dive into some of the questions that we should be asking independently and as a collective to really make change right now." right?
Yeah.
That's funny.
You
We're on the
tell
same
you
path with this one.
Yeah, you tell a great story that was a seminal moment clearly in Cal's life about a letter that he
Mm,
wrote as a very young kid. Can you talk about that for a sec?
I can. Uh, I, I think I want to say he was 7, but I might be saying that incorrectly. But you're right. He was a young boy, and it was the time when President Kennedy had been assassinated, and Cal at that time wanted to know how it felt for uh, President Johnson. I almost forgot that one. Lyndon B. Johnson. How he felt to be essentially defaulted to president. Like, did he want to be president? Was he excited about this, or how do you feel in a situation like that? And he did what most people wouldn't do or didn't do. Many people, I think, probably were thinking about that prompt and that question, but he wrote it down and put it in an envelope and addressed it to the White House.
Okay.
And I think it was about a month or so after, a letter comes back, and he tells the story. I mean, I'm trying to tell the story like Cal, because again, he's so poetic in how he speaks. He goes to the mailbox, or I think his mother went to the mailbox, came with the letter, and obviously there was just like this excitement. And there's a letter from the White House. The neighbors were coming over, like everyone gather in the kitchen type thing, right? And they open it up, and there was a beautiful message in there from the White House that seemed, from Cal's perspective, uh, that wasn't, a canned response that goes out to every single person, at least in those times, right? It's probably different now,
Sure.
but there were little nuances to the letter that came back in that message, and he was the talk of the town. And I remember him saying something to the effect of going back to school, that at that point he transitioned from the boy at school to the man in his
Yeah.
class type thing. But the lesson, though, and I think that this lesson has fueled his career, and what he's doing was that one question again can get you to the most powerful person in the world at that time, essentially, right? And it relates back to how I feel about these prompts. Like, one question can change everything, and for Cal, it did, because it sent him down a path of asking questions for a living.
Yeah. Certainly that was ample encouragement to get a letter from the President of the
Yeah,
United States.
of course.
Yeah. That's a great story. Um, so let's talk about Kobe. Everybody knows Kobe. Of course, I um, misspent a good decade of my life trying to imitate him on the mean streets of New York City. I was a street baller for 10 years,
Okay.
messing up with. I probably had no business being in a lot of places that I was as a smaller fellow, but there I was trying to be like Mike and then like Kobe. So and he obviously inspired so many people in so many ways. So get into Kobe and his
Yeah,
question if you could.
of course. Kobe was challenging to write because there's so much mental fitness in his life, and in his books and interviews, that it was like, where do you even focus? But I landed on something that I feel like all of us have experienced at one point in our lives, and probably continue to experience. I mean, I know I still do, and I'm in surrounded by these practices all the time. So his prompt, and I'll never forget, it was the editor for Stephen Hawking's book, A Brief History of Time, that actually helped me with this prompt, because he had taken a look at the book at one point and completely changed the feeling of it. And his prompt is, how do I get to the rim? And he changed it because this has nothing to do with basketball, but it's interesting because we know Kobe obviously from his basketball career, and it has everything to do with how Kobe managed his internal negotiation, and specifically things like, and this is where I think it relates to a lot of us, but how many times has your alarm gone off in the morning, or your however you're waking up, and you go through this mental negotiation at what seems like Mach speed about sleeping maybe a little bit longer, or I'll get the workout in the afternoon instead of the morning. I know in my case, a couple times has happened where, you know what, I went to bed a little bit later. Sleep is really important for my health. I just need to sleep an extra 20 minutes. I'll do my writing. This was in the middle of writing the book. I'll write at 2 p.m. instead. I'll block off that time. And we all know what typically happens. Life happens and the writing doesn't happen, and you're feeling bad about yourself because you didn't check off the thing that you wanted to do that day. The workout doesn't happen and so forth. And in my research on Kobe, he was no different. He was waking up, I think, at 4 or 4:30 in the morning to get an extra workout in on top of the regular team workouts for the day. And he stated that I, it wasn't that he was springing out of the bed every time his alarm went off, but he spent the time getting clear on why he was springing out of the bed. And that
Mm.
was to win an NBA championship, right? I mean, that was Kobe's motivation, but we all have our own motivations. But again, if we can get clear on what do I want for my life, right? Or what is it that I'm working towards this year, then you keep that motivation or that answer as your anchor. And when that negotiation starts, because it will, you can cut it, stop, right? And again, you have that pause. Okay, I'm getting up and I'm going. So yeah, that was the motivation there. And he left another really interesting nugget too about just how powerful our minds are that I'd love to share. And he provide somewhat of a quote, like, I think this is when he had torn at one point in his career, he torn his Achilles, and he was out, obviously recovering, and he makes the point about the power of the mind. That, okay, I'm sitting on my couch or my chair, I can't really walk well, it's healing, but if the house catches on fire and I need to run up the stairs to grab my kids and save my kids, you're not thinking at all about your injury, and you just go into activation mode, right? I mean, that's your mind. That is all your
Absolutely.
mind, right?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and there's ways to, with that insight, there are ways to game the system, if you want to call it that. I
Sure.
mean, you know, you may be, I mean, pain is inevitable, right? You may have sprained your ankle and you're feeling this throbbing sensation and you're really frustrated around because you can't do anything, or something more psychological, like maybe you got passed over for that big promotion or you didn't get that part that you were going out for, and there's a feeling of disappointment that's welling up inside of you. And then out of the blue, your sister calls and she's like, guess what, I'm pregnant. And all of a sudden
Yeah.
you're going to be an uncle and you're so excited.
Yeah.
And of course,
Like that,
where
right?
where did the pain in your ankle go? It just
Yeah,
disappeared.
absolutely.
Well, where did your disappointment about not getting that part go? It just disappeared. And to realize that these are all kind of gymnastics of the mind. And I have like a little photo of my daughter, my
Hmm.
middle daughter, Lolly, that I keep in my wallet. And in a way, I play it as a trump card
Yeah.
because oftentimes I have a lot of modalities that I can leverage around emotion, but I can always just pick that up and look at it, and it just eclipses any other negative thought or negative sensation that's arising in
Yeah.
consciousness. So sometimes I'm like, okay, that's my little trump card, and it
Yeah.
reminds me just of that again, yeah, that all we have in life is the experience that exists within our mind,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
and where are we going to focus our that attention?
Yeah.
uh,
Could,
anyway,
could
so I
we
thought
stay
that,
there, because that's a great
yeah,
that's a great example, and it makes me think of other interviews as well. But just that reminder system that you have in your wallet with your daughter's photo. I mean, even Apollo Ono is another profile in the book, Olympic level athlete, and his Olympic level reminder system are Post-its in the places he sees most often in his house to remind him, why he's doing something, or what's going well in his life, for example. And I want to pause and bring that up because it's something I think anyone can do right now within a matter of 2 minutes and have the confidence that you have that happiness list or that list of things, people, and activities that instantly can change your mood and mindset, right? If you just
Yes.
ask the question, like, what are the 5 or 10 things that I know without a shadow of a doubt will put a smile on my face? Simple as that, right?
Yeah.
And then
So
when
good.
something comes up, you default to the list.
Yeah. It's so simple, and it's such a useful, practical quotidian tool.
Yeah.
Um, and I mean, Kobe had a very distinct, clear mission, right? This idea of winning an NBA championship. You could just paint it on the wall or whatever. And
Yeah.
he lost some before he won some.
Yeah.
Um, and it's that kind of vision might not be as clear to you or to someone listening or to me. We're likely not competing for an NBA championship. But it really does help to get clear about what your vision is, about what you are manifesting. And this was a
Yeah.
kind of a Wayne Dyer um, concept, but he had this idea of manifesting from the end. So becoming very, very clear on what that is. I mean, for you, it may be, the release of this stunning book where
Yeah.
that is your goal. And then you're just manifesting from the end. So when you're doing that, life becomes really peaceful and light because you're just chopping wood and carrying water in the Buddhist tradition, anyways.
Yeah.
And you're just waking up and doing the work that informs the manifestation of that end product. And you
Yeah.
can be protean and flexible about what that end product is, and that's fine. There's no shame in that. But it really helps. That clarity really
Oh,
helps.
it just makes life so much more enjoyable. And I feel it right now because I couldn't be in a more different place with the launch of this book than when I was at launching the app. I mean, the app was very much number of people, conversions, retention, all of that. Whereas this book, and it just I think it happened naturally with the process that I was going through. Of course, I'd love for as many eyes to hit the pages and minds to be affected, but my ultimate goal is actually to go through the launch process clear, so that I
Mm,
can see when we're talking about courses that feels right. That feels right to go down that path, or this doesn't feel right. And just to be excited for the unknown, that I know I'm putting the effort in, so I know results will come, but I don't know exactly what those results are, and that's okay. And being excited about the opportunity that lies within the spider web of what a project like this can bring. And it feels so much lighter
mm.
than the app. So much lighter.
Yeah, yeah. Um, good. Good for you to
Yeah,
be
thank
going
you.
into it that way. Um, and really, what I'm hearing from you is that you're more concerned with staying close to the work than you are any adulation that your ego might require. And we
Yeah.
all are human. Love to
Yeah,
have
of
the
course.
flames of my ego fanned from time to time. But if we can learn anything from people like Kobe or Michael Jordan, they were so close to the work. I mean,
Oh, it's
they
just
were
so true.
talented. Sure, they had some God given abilities, but they would have never done anything near what they accomplished if they hadn't stayed so diligently close to the work. So, anyways, it's
Yeah,
something that I try to remind myself of all the time. Let's talk about
absolutely.
Coco Chanel. Totally different,
Oh yeah,
which
that
I
was a high
love
profile.
because you really pulled in so many such a multiplicity of characters here. So Coco, take it away.
Yeah, Coco Chanel. I mean, that man, she was challenging. I mean, I didn't interview her. I guess I could have when I was super young, had I met
Maybe.
her. But um, Coco, when writing that one, that was one of those start stops about 3 times, and I had to jump into other profiles and give it time to breathe a bit, but eventually landed on something that felt right, and her opening prompt uh, is around the idea of, like, how you want people to feel, right, when you leave, or how can you become irreplaceable, I think is the exact language. And if you think of Coco, and it doesn't take long. You just start looking at a few YouTube videos or reading some of her books, or her biographers, I should say. She had this presence. And it's so interesting because the presence actually links with any of her work, like, Chanel number 5. Everyone knows about that perfume, and it commands this presence. And so does Coco, right? So her whole profile is centered around, or what was inspired by the research, and how she lived her life, is around slowing down and pausing and thinking about how we want to leave people feeling when we leave a room, right?
Mm.
Because people will leave with something, and it's either a feeling, or a vibe into the room that we want to be left, or not, or maybe we don't even know how people are thinking about us. So if we can again take some active reflection, or deploy some active reflection, then we can be more intentional with when we show up and command that presence, just like a Coco Chanel has, and how her brand and legacy continues to. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, I mean, literally an aroma has outlived her. you know,
Yes.
in number 5, to create something so resilient and timeless as part of your legacy is, I suppose, irreplaceability. Um,
Yes.
and I think we've all engaged in certain kinds of exercises from time to time of, like, what's my epitaph, or what is the eulogy that will be given
Hmm.
about me at my funeral. And
Yeah.
it really does focus our attention around, like, what is my mark? What is my unique signature for the world? And that can be very clarifying because, we can be doing a million different things, and it is very focusing uh,
Yeah.
in a way to kind of engage in this kind of, like, this what is my epitaph kind of
Well,
thought
yeah, and
experiment.
and this is the objective with all these profiles. I mean, they're not new practices. I'm not inventing anything. A lot of these practices have been around for thousands of years. I'm not inventing new questions, but you know, there's slight shifts in perspective that then land with interesting, like, even for me. I mean, I didn't know much about Coco Chanel other than what you most people know on the surface level. But as I was diving in, and reading, and doing the research to write the profile, I mean, it caused me to sit back and think a little bit, right? And do it from a different angle or different lens,
Yeah,
which you can continue to revisit this.
yeah. Well, it's so interesting. I mean, I didn't know anything about her, honestly. That she was in an orphanage growing up that
Hmm.
was run by nuns, which more than likely influenced the
The
creation of the
little
little
black
black
dress,
dress. I was like, oh my
correct?
god, that's such a good story.
Yeah.
um, one of the things when I was unpacking that question, how do I become irreplaceable? One of the questions that came up for me, and and this is sort of a Byron Katie technique, which she flips the
Mm.
question on its head. I asked myself, how do I become replaceable?
Ooh.
And I often ask that in a business context because the more replaceable I am, the more growth that it provides for those within my company, for example. I happen to be the CEO of my particular small little corner of the universe. But what I always actually like to instill is within the companies that I've run is a feeling of replaceability or dispensability, because if you are replaceable and dispensable, there is more likelihood that then you will be promoted or grow within the company, because management will look at you and say, and they won't say, well, God, Mark is the only one that can do that job. I can't
Sure.
promote Mark because, so
I
I
like
think
that.
there's actually quite a bit of wisdom in making yourself replaceable, and
Sure.
and thinking about that a little bit. So all these questions have their flip opposite.
Oh,
that
I love it.
sometimes,
I love
yeah,
it. It
yeah,
just, this stuff lights me up. It's
yeah,
endless.
yeah. It's so good. So let's do one more, and then we can
Sure.
just kind of take it out into outer space. So Jerry Colonna, who I know
Mm.
vaguely, who I know him as an investor, and I know he does a lot of coaching for CEOs and executives. So go with Jerry for a minute.
Jerry, yes, Jerry is. He's another one that when you listen to him speak, he speaks slowly, and you hang on the words and you listen. And his Jerry's backstory was, or is, I should say, is he founded. I can't remember who his partner was. The name escapes me, but
Fred, I think it's Fred Wilson, right?
Fred Wilson, yeah, of
Yeah.
course. So they founded Flatiron Ventures in New York at the in the .com era, and they from my research or what he shared with me, they were the hot investment firm at that time in that space and technology, and
Oh
things were
yeah.
rocking for them. Financially, he was doing really well. Is out meeting the who's who and whatnot, but inside he was not doing so well, and there was a disconnect to the point where I think it was right near or right after 9/11 he found himself on a subway platform in New York questioning whether he was going to jump off in front of a train. And I mean, you mentioned your daughter's photo in your wallet. His kid's image faces flashed in front of his mind and gave him that microsecond to make a different decision. And I mean, I think a lot of people, and myself included, because he's imparted a lot of wisdom on myself, and I've actually reread his profile for myself and journaled on it in a couple times in the last few months, actually, when I was faced with some challenging times, because Jerry, he made it through that, and through his through his work with CEOs and startup founders and whatnot. He's kind of been known as the CEO whisperer, and he helps people again, slow down and think and reflect. Um, but ultimately, what I learned from him is he really focuses on getting people to a point where realizing that we can all meet the world as it is, and that everything is impermanent. And that's what his profile is all about, is really, how can you accept the world as it is? And especially right now, that was one of the times, just going, there's so much uncertainty, there's so much volatility out there, and so many differences of opinions when it comes to everything going on with this pandemic and so many other topics right now, that there's some comfort knowing that all is impermanent, that this too shall pass. The good passes, the bad passes, but this will pass as well. And to find some sort of solace or some sort of comfort in accepting where we're at right now. And, I would layer on another, or basically practice stack on something from like Ryan Holiday or Stoicism, and focus on what you can control in the
Mm.
situation. So when you add those two together, you've got a nice little formula to really process challenging situations. And, I'm really thankful for Jerry for that.
Yeah. I I mean, I think this cuts to potentially the most existential question we can ask about what is the nature of being human or being conscious. Um,
Yeah.
and I'll balance that serious, grave question with something flippant, which is like, we've all been drunk, most of us at some point or another,
Hmm.
and we're filled with courage and clarity and of that kind of inebriated kind of like I can do anything, only to melt into a pathetic puddle of the hangover, the next morning.
So true.
And and I might say to you, Mark, well done. This is the best book I've ever read. It's going to be a #1 New York Times bestseller, and I could stoke your ego, and you
Yeah.
could sort of revel in your ego stoking. But notice that the same part of you that feels pride also feels jealousy
Hmm.
or envy or disappointment. And it is the identification with this part of ourselves that really informs what is known as the ego.
Oh
And
yeah. Yeah.
the ego can be the origin of a tremendous amount of suffering.
Hmm.
And the more that we can witness phenomena arising moment to moment, essentially become completely comfortable with impermanence, the more that we can eschew suffering. And this is right out of the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism, that
Yeah.
there's this state called dukkha, which is really just a state of suffering, but it's more a state of unsatisfactoriness in one's life. And it is
Okay.
very, very connected to an inability to recognize impermanence and this notion that that I am this stable self, and I am separate from you, and I'm separate from nature, and I'm separate from God, and I'm living in this external mean universe that's dominated by survival of the fittest. And all of this is quite honestly an illusion. There is
Hmm.
no real, reliable, stable self. We just explored it. It's changing at every moment. I mean,
Yeah.
really, the experience of being alive is really experience. That's it. I mean, you could think of it as witnessing thoughts, sensations, feelings arise and subside into consciousness moment by moment. Um,
Sure.
but the more that we can connect to that sacred presence, which appears just again and again in so many of the stories and questions that you featured in this book, uh, the more we feel light.
Hmm.
And enlightenment might just be simply that, just feeling light, you know?
Yeah.
Um, and so much of that, I think, has its germ in the recognition of impermanence.
Yeah.
And it's a very liberating idea, because when we're not thrusting the needs of our ego onto each other, then we really become whole. When I don't need your approval to feel good about myself, or if I don't think that I'm being judged through the eyes of the world around me, but I'm absolutely 100% good with who I am, then I'm living in the absence of need. And when we don't have need, we tend to then think of love as something given. We begin to tap into compassion. We bring loving kindness to the presence of suffering. So it's just this is an area where I really focus really on my own life,
Of course.
and I thought it was, and I'm glad that I'm so glad that you addressed it.
Well, I mean, I shared it with just the experience of the book, right, and the launch, and I feel like I'm just starting to hit a tip of what that feels like. And I've
Mm.
never felt like that in my life. And I have to say, I agree with you. It feels lighter, and it just there have been moments in the last 6 to 12 months where I remember sitting back, and my wife and I would talk like we would say things, we should feel very stressed right now, but for whatever reason, we don't. And there's this trust in the path and the journey that we're on together, obviously. And for myself, like, there's trust in the work that I'm putting out there, and that it's the right work and it feels right. And thinking of Jerry, and like you just said, if the book hits these lists or whatever, that's great. I'll celebrate that, but that too is impermanent, right? So the more I can dive into the present, and the fact that because of this project, you and I are getting to connect. And I'm gonna hang up this podcast feeling energized and excited for the evening. I mean, it doesn't get better than that, right?
No, the process is the product. Always.
Always.
We keep relearning that over and
Yeah.
over again. For the last hour and 11 minutes and 39 seconds, I have been right here with you and nowhere else. And that lights us up as humans to give each other that sort of attention. I mean, we talked about it when we talked about Chip, right? Being absolutely available and present with our attention for each other. And it doesn't really get any better.
It's awesome.
Hey, thanks for watching. If you liked this interview from the Commune podcast, then I think you'll love this video right here.
So Epictetus says, when an impression occurs to you, when a stimulus occurs to you, say to yourself, stay a moment, impression. Let me test you. Let me discover what you are. So they're trying to train people not to have knee-jerk reactions.